At exactly 9:47 p.m. on June 14, 2019, in a small town just outside Richmond, Virginia, a 911 call came in from the Riverside Grand Hotel. The caller was hysterical. She could barely get the words out. When police arrived 7 minutes later, they found a groom hiding behind a catering van in the hotel parking lot. His tuxedo jacket was torn. His hands were shaking. And just 3 hours earlier, he had stood at an altar and promised to love and honor his bride for the rest of his life. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Inside the bridal suite on the third floor, officers found the bride's best friend sitting on the floor, her makeup smeared, her dress torn at the shoulder, trembling so violently she couldn't speak. What happened in that room during those 23 minutes would destroy not just a marriage, but an entire family. And the bride wouldn't learn the full truth until she watched the security footage 3 days later. This is the story of Emma Hartley, a 29-year-old elementary school teacher who thought she had found her forever. This is the story of Daniel Crane, the man who convinced everyone he was the perfect husband. And this is the story of Madison Parker, the best friend who became the victim no one expected. What you're about to hear isn't a sensationalized crime drama. It's a real case that went to trial. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and the terrifying realization that the person sleeping next to you might be a stranger. And it raises a question that haunts everyone who hears it. How well do we really know the people we love? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. Emma Hartley grew up believing in fairy tales. Not the ones with magic and monsters, but the kind where good people meet, fall in love, and build a life together. She met Daniel Crane in the fall of 2015 at Virginia Commonwealth University, in a crowded lecture hall where she dropped her books and he helped her pick them up. It was the kind of meet cute that would make her grandmother smile. Daniel was studying business. Emma was working toward her teaching degree. They started with coffee, then dinners, then weekends exploring Richmond together. By their second year, they were inseparable. Daniel had this way of making Emma feel seen. He remembered the small things, the way she liked her coffee, the fact that she hated the sound of styrofoam, the way her voice changed when she talked about her students. He was charming in a way that felt genuine, attentive, without being overbearing. Her friends adored him. Her parents called him the son they never had. And Madison Parker, Emma's best friend since middle school, told her more than once that she'd found a good one. Madison had been there through everything. Through Emma's first heartbreak in high school, through her father's death when they were juniors in college, through every late-night phone call and every questionable decision. She was the kind of friend who showed up with ice cream and honesty, the kind who would tell you when your outfit didn't work, but would also fight anyone who said a bad word about you. So when Emma got engaged in the spring of 2018, there was never a question about who would stand beside her on her wedding day. The engagement party was held at Daniel's parents' house in the suburbs, a sprawling colonial with a pool and a yard that seemed to stretch forever. It was a beautiful night in May, warm but not humid, the kind of evening where everything feels possible. There were maybe 50 people there, family and close friends, and the champagne flowed freely. Emma remembers feeling happy, genuinely happy, watching Daniel laugh with her uncle, seeing her mother cry happy tears as she hugged Daniel's mom. But she also remembers something else. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, Emma found Daniel in the kitchen, drunk and loud, arguing with one of his groomsmen about something she couldn't quite make out. She'd never seen him like that before, sloppy and aggressive, his words slurring together. When she asked him about it the next morning, he apologized, said he'd just gotten carried away with the celebration, that it wouldn't happen again. And she believed him, because that's what you do when you love someone. You believe them when they tell you they'll do better. But Madison noticed something else that night. She was helping clean up in the backyard when she saw Daniel watching her from the porch. Not a casual glance, but a long, fixed stare that made her uncomfortable. When she mentioned it to Emma a few days later, Emma laughed it off. "Daniel's just protective," she'd said. "He probably thought you looked upset or something." Madison didn't push it. She wanted to believe Emma was right. The wedding was set for June 14th, 2019, at the Riverside Grand Hotel, a historic venue just outside Richmond, with views of the James River and gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Emma had been planning it for over a year, every detail carefully considered, from the ivory roses to the string quartet that would play during the ceremony. The rehearsal dinner was the night before, held in a private room at the hotel. It was supposed to be intimate, just the wedding party and immediate family. But it felt bigger than that, louder, more chaotic. Daniel seemed off that night. He was drinking heavily, downing whiskey like it was water, and his jokes were getting meaner, more cutting. At one point, he made a comment about one of the bridesmaids that made the table go quiet. Emma pulled him aside, asked him to slow down on the drinks, but he waved her off, told her she was being uptight. Madison watched the interaction from across the room and felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd been around enough drunk people in her life to know the difference between someone who's just having a good time and someone who's teetering on the edge of something darker. Daniel was the latter. When the dinner ended, Madison caught Emma in the hallway and asked if she was okay. Emma smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "She's fine," she said. "He's just nervous about tomorrow." Everyone gets nervous before their wedding. Madison wanted to say more, wanted to tell Emma what she'd seen in Daniel's eyes during that argument, but she didn't. Because you don't tell a bride the night before her wedding that her groom might be a problem. You smile and you hug her, and you tell her everything's going to be perfect. The wedding day started like a dream. The weather was flawless, clear skies and a gentle breeze. And Emma looked radiant in her dress, a simple but elegant gown with lace sleeves and a train that seemed to go on forever. Madison stood beside her as she got ready, adjusting her veil, making sure every curl was in place. They took photos in the bridal suite, laughing and crying and making toasts with cheap champagne in plastic flutes. For a moment, everything felt right. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel cried when he saw Emma walking down the aisle, and when they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure. He promised to love her in sickness and in health, to honor and cherish her, to be faithful and true. Emma believed every word. The reception was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the river. The room was filled with white flowers and candlelight, and a DJ played all of Emma's favorite songs. People danced and ate, and congratulated the happy couple. Daniel seemed better, more like himself, smiling and shaking hands and thanking people for coming. But as the night wore on, he started drinking again. Madison noticed it first. She was standing near the bar when she saw Daniel take 3 shots of vodka in quick succession, barely pausing between them. By 9 o'clock, his eyes were glassy, and his movements were slow and deliberate in the way drunk people move when they're trying to convince everyone they're sober. At 9:15 p.m., Madison excused herself from the dance floor and went upstairs to the bridal suite. She'd been wearing her heels for hours, and her feet were killing her. She just wanted to sit down for a few minutes, maybe fix her makeup, take a breath away from the noise. The suite was on the 3rd floor, a large room with a sitting area and a bathroom bigger than most bedrooms. Madison kicked off her shoes and sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, looking at the photos people were already posting from the wedding. She was smiling at a picture of Emma and Daniel's first dance when she heard the door open. She looked up expecting to see Emma, but it was Daniel. He closed the door behind him and locked it. Madison stood up. She asked him what he was doing, why he wasn't downstairs with his wife. He didn't answer. He just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between confusion and intent. She told him he should go back to the reception, that people would be looking for him. He took a step toward her. Madison backed up until she hit the wall. Her heart was pounding now, and she could smell the alcohol on him from across the room. She asked him again to leave, but her voice was shaking. Daniel moved closer, and then his hands were on her shoulders, pushing her back against the wall. She tried to push him away, but he was stronger, and the alcohol had made him aggressive in a way she'd never seen before. She said his name, loud, trying to snap him out of it, but he didn't stop. He pressed himself against her, his breath hot and sour against her face, and his hands started moving down her body. Madison shoved him hard, using all her strength, and managed to create enough space to move toward the door. But Daniel grabbed her arm and yanked her back, and she stumbled, her dress tearing at the shoulder as she fell against the coffee table. She screamed, loud enough that anyone in the hallway would have heard it. And then the door burst open. It was one of the groomsmen, a guy named Tyler, who'd heard Madison scream from down the hall. He took one look at the scene, at Madison on the floor with her dress torn, at Daniel standing over her with his shirt half untucked and his face flushed, and he understood immediately. Tyler grabbed Daniel by the arm and pulled him toward the door. Daniel tried to fight back, swinging wildly, but Tyler was sober and stronger. He shoved Daniel out into the hallway and told him to stay away from Madison, then came back into the suite to check on her. Madison was shaking so hard she could barely speak. Tyler asked if she was okay, if Daniel had hurt her, and she nodded, tears streaming down her face. She told him what happened, and Tyler's expression went from concern to fury. He told her to stay there, that he was going to find Emma. Madison begged him not to. She didn't want to ruin Emma's wedding, didn't want to be the reason this perfect day turned into a nightmare. But Tyler ignored her. He left the suite and went back downstairs, and within minutes, the entire reception knew something was wrong. Emma found out in the worst possible way. She was dancing with her uncle when Tyler pulled her aside and told her she needed to come upstairs. She asked what was wrong, and Tyler just said Madison needed her. Emma's first thought was that Madison was sick. Maybe she'd had too much to drink or was feeling overwhelmed. She never imagined what she was about to walk into. When Emma opened the door to the bridal suite, she saw Madison sitting on the couch, still shaking, her makeup smeared from crying, her dress torn at the shoulder, and she saw Daniel being held back by two other groomsmen in the hallway. Emma looked between them, trying to piece together what had happened. And then Madison started talking. She told Emma everything. How Daniel had followed her upstairs, how he'd locked the door, how he'd pushed her against the wall and put his hands on her, how she'd screamed and fought and tried to get away, how if Tyler hadn't heard her, she didn't know what would have happened. Emma didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, staring at Madison and then at Daniel, and the room felt like it was tilting. She asked Daniel if it was true. He denied it immediately, said Madison was lying, that she'd been flirting with him all night, that she'd asked him to come upstairs. Madison's face went white. She told Emma it wasn't true, that Daniel was the one who'd followed her, that she'd never do that to her. Emma looked at her best friend, the person she'd known for half her life, and then she looked at her husband, the man she'd just married 3 hours ago, and she didn't know who to believe. Daniel kept talking, kept insisting Madison had misunderstood, that he'd just come upstairs to check on her, that she'd been drunk and confused, but his hands were shaking, and he wouldn't meet Emma's eyes. One of the groomsmen told Emma there was more. He said Daniel had been acting strange all night, that he'd seen him watching Madison during the reception, that he'd overheard Daniel make an inappropriate comment about her earlier in the day. Another bridesmaid came forward and said she'd seen Daniel grab Madison's arm during the cocktail hour, pulling her aside to talk to her, and that Madison had looked uncomfortable. Emma felt like she was drowning. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and instead, she was standing in a hotel room trying to figure out if her husband had just assaulted her best friend. Someone called the police. Emma doesn't remember who, but within 15 minutes, there were officers in the hallway asking questions and taking statements. Daniel was pulled aside, and he kept insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that Madison had wanted him to come upstairs, that he'd done nothing wrong. But his story kept changing. First, he said Madison had texted him to meet her in the suite. Then he said she'd asked him to help her with something. Then he said he couldn't remember why he'd gone upstairs at all. The police separated everyone and started interviewing them one by one. Madison gave her statement first, describing in detail what had happened, how Daniel had locked the door, how he'd pushed her against the wall, how his hands had been all over her before she managed to push him away. She was crying through most of it, and an officer had to keep handing her tissues. When it was Daniel's turn, his lawyer, who had somehow been called and arrived within the hour, advised him not to say anything. But Daniel couldn't seem to help himself. He kept talking, kept trying to explain, and with every word, he made things worse. He admitted he'd been drinking heavily. He admitted he'd gone upstairs to the bridal suite. He admitted he'd been alone with Madison, but he insisted nothing inappropriate had happened, that it was all just a misunderstanding. The police asked if they could see the security footage from the hotel. The manager, who by this point was mortified that this was happening at his venue, agreed immediately. He led the officers to the security office and pulled up the footage from the third floor. What they saw on that screen changed everything. The footage showed Daniel entering the bridal suite at 9:16 p.m. It showed him locking the door behind him. It showed Madison trying to leave 4 minutes later, but the door wouldn't open because Daniel had locked it from the inside. The footage didn't show what happened inside the room, but it showed Madison's face when she finally managed to get the door open after Tyler intervened. She looked terrified. The police arrested Daniel at 9:47 p.m. They found him hiding behind a catering van in the parking lot, trying to avoid the officers who were looking for him. When they brought him out in handcuffs, Emma was standing in the hotel lobby, still in her wedding dress, watching the man she'd just married being led away by police. The wedding guests had been told there was a medical emergency and asked to leave. Most of them had no idea what had really happened. Emma's mother tried to shield her from the scene, but Emma pushed her away. She needed to see it. She needed to understand that this was real, that her marriage was over, before it had even really begun. Madison was taken to the hospital, not because she was physically injured in a way that required treatment, but because the police needed a medical examination as part of the investigation. Emma went with her, still in her wedding dress, sitting in a sterile hospital room at midnight on what was supposed to be her wedding night, holding her best friend's hand, while a nurse took photos of the bruises on Madison's arms and the tear in her dress. Madison kept apologizing. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd ruined Emma's wedding, that she should have just stayed downstairs, that this was all her fault. Emma told her to stop. None of this was Madison's fault. It was Daniel's. It was all Daniel's. But even as Emma said the words, part of her didn't want to believe them. Because believing them meant accepting that she'd been wrong about Daniel, that she'd missed the signs, that she'd married a man capable of something like this. Over the next few days, more information came out. The police interviewed everyone who'd been at the wedding, and a picture started to emerge of a man who wasn't who Emma thought he was. One of Daniel's college friends admitted that there had been an incident years ago, a party where Daniel had been accused of getting too aggressive with a woman, but it had been swept under the rug, dismissed as a drunken misunderstanding. Another friend said Daniel had a history of becoming mean and controlling when he drank, that there had been times when his girlfriend at the time had called them worried about his behavior. Emma's mind raced back through her relationship with Daniel, looking for the signs she'd missed. The way he'd get jealous when she talked to other men. The way he'd sometimes make comments about her appearance that felt more like criticisms than compliments. The way he'd dismiss her concerns, tell her she was overreacting, being too sensitive. She'd written all of it off as normal relationship stuff, little quirks that every couple had to navigate. But now, looking back, she wondered if they'd been warnings. Madison stopped answering her phone. For 2 days, Emma couldn't reach her. She left voicemails and sent texts, but Madison didn't respond. Emma was terrified that Madison blamed her, that their friendship was over, that she'd lost her husband and her best friend on the same night. Finally, on the 3rd day, Madison called. She'd been in therapy, she said, trying to process what had happened. She didn't blame Emma. She could never blame Emma. but she needed time, needed space to figure out how to move forward. Emma understood, or at least she tried to. Daniel was released on bail 3 days after his arrest. The judge set it at $50,000, and Daniel's parents paid it immediately. As a condition of his release, he was ordered to have no contact with Madison, no contact with Emma, and to surrender his passport. He moved back in with his parents, and according to mutual friends, he spent most of his time insisting he was innocent, that Madison had wanted it, that the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. His lawyer started building a defense based on the idea that Madison had been drunk, that she'd misremembered what happened, that there was reasonable doubt about whether any assault had actually occurred. Emma filed for an annulment. She didn't want a divorce, didn't want to be legally tied to Daniel for any longer than necessary. She wanted the marriage erased, as if it had never happened. Her lawyer told her it would be easier to just get divorced, that annulments were complicated, but Emma didn't care. She wanted this gone, wanted every trace of Daniel removed from her life. The legal process dragged on for months. Madison had to give a deposition, had to relive the assault over and over again, while Daniel's lawyer tried to poke holes in her story. They asked her how much she'd had to drink that night. They asked what she'd been wearing. They asked if she'd ever had feelings for Daniel, if she'd ever flirted with him, if she'd been jealous of Emma's relationship. Madison broke down on the stand more than once. Emma was there for every minute of it, sitting in the courtroom, watching her best friend be torn apart by lawyers who cared more about winning than about the truth. Daniel never took the stand. His lawyer advised against it. But he sat at the defense table every day, stone-faced, as if none of this had anything to do with him. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced the security footage. Not just the hallway footage, but additional footage from a secondary camera that the hotel hadn't initially disclosed. This camera, positioned near the stairwell, had captured audio from the hallway. And on that audio, clear as day, was Madison's voice saying no, saying stop, saying Daniel's name, over and over, before the scream that brought Tyler running. The jury heard Madison begging Daniel to let her go. They heard Daniel's response, slurred and aggressive, telling her to calm down, to stop making a scene, that she was overreacting. They heard the moment when Madison's voice changed from pleading to panic. The courtroom went silent as the audio played. Emma closed her eyes and listened, and she felt something inside her break. Because there it was, undeniable proof that everything Madison had said was true, that Daniel had done this, that the man she'd loved and trusted and married was capable of something this horrific. After the audio was played, Daniel's lawyer asked for a recess. When they came back, he tried to argue that the audio was taken out of context, that it didn't prove anything definitively, but the damage was done. The jury had heard enough. It took them less than 3 hours to reach a verdict. Daniel Crane was found guilty of attempted sexual assault, aggravated assault, and unlawful restraint. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. When the sentence was read, Daniel finally showed emotion. He started crying, telling the judge this was a mistake, that he was a good person, that he didn't deserve this. But the judge was unmoved. He told Daniel that he'd violated the trust of everyone who cared about him, that he'd committed a heinous act on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life, and that the sentence reflected the seriousness of his crime. Emma didn't feel relief when the verdict was read. She didn't feel vindicated or justified. She just felt tired. Tired of the hearings and the testimonies and the endless questions about how she hadn't seen this coming. Madison moved away after the trial. She got a job in Seattle, as far from Virginia as she could get without leaving the country. She told Emma she needed a fresh start, needed to be somewhere where people didn't know her as the woman who was assaulted at her best friend's wedding. They still talk, text mostly, occasional phone calls on birthdays and holidays. But it's not the same. How could it be? The assault didn't just destroy Daniel's life. It shattered something between Emma and Madison too. Something that can never quite be repaired. Emma went back to teaching, threw herself into her work, tried to rebuild a life that felt normal. But she couldn't shake the questions. How had she not seen it? How had she spent years with someone and missed the signs that he was capable of? This. Were there other women before Madison, women who never came forward, who blamed themselves the way Madison initially had? Her therapist told her that predators are good at hiding, that they're experts at presenting one face to the world while keeping their true nature hidden. But that didn't make Emma feel better. It just made her wonder if she'd ever be able to trust her judgment again. She started volunteering at a local organization that supported survivors of sexual assault, attending their support groups, listening to stories that were eerily similar to Madison's. She learned that what happened at her wedding wasn't unique, that it happened more often than people wanted to admit, that weddings with their alcohol and emotion and assumption of trust created the perfect environment for predators to operate. One night, about a year after the trial, Emma was going through some boxes of Daniel's things that his parents had asked her to sort through. Most of it was junk, old clothes, and college textbooks, things that could be thrown away. But at the bottom of one box, she found a notebook. It was from Daniel's senior year of college, filled with class notes and doodles. But tucked between two pages was a letter, handwritten, dated 3 years before their wedding. The letter was addressed to no one, just a stream of consciousness written late at night. In it, Daniel wrote about his struggles with alcohol, about times he'd blacked out and woken up not remembering what he'd done. He wrote about an incident at a party where he'd been accused of inappropriate behavior and how he'd managed to convince everyone it was a misunderstanding. He wrote about feeling out of control, about hating himself, about hoping that getting into a serious relationship would fix him, would make him a better person. Emma read the letter 3 times, trying to understand. Part of her wanted to feel sympathy for Daniel, wanted to believe that he'd been struggling with demons he couldn't control. But mostly she felt angry, because Daniel had known. He'd known he had a problem, and instead of getting help, instead of being honest with her, he'd decided that loving her would be enough to fix him. He'd made her part of his solution, without ever telling her there was a problem. She gave the letter to the prosecution, even though the trial was over. They added it to the case file, said it might be useful if Daniel ever tried to appeal, but Emma didn't care about that. She just needed to let it go, needed to stop carrying Daniel's secrets. As time passed, Emma started to rebuild. She bought a small house outside Richmond, adopted a dog, started dating again, though it took a long time before she could trust anyone enough to let them close. She changed her name back, erasing the brief time she'd been Emma Crane. She reconnected with old friends, made new ones, learned to be okay with the fact that some questions would never have answers. Madison came to visit 2 years after the trial. It was awkward at first, neither of them knowing quite what to say, how to navigate a friendship that had been so fundamentally altered. But they went out to dinner, talked about everything except the wedding, and by the end of the night, something had shifted. They'd never get back what they'd lost, but they were finding a new version of their friendship, one built on survival rather than innocence. The last Emma heard, Daniel was serving his sentence at a state facility about 2 hours from Richmond. He'd been denied parole after 3 years, the board citing a lack of remorse and a continued insistence that he'd been wrongly convicted. Emma didn't attend the hearing, didn't want to see him or hear him try to explain away what he'd done. She'd moved on, as much as someone can move on from something like that. But she thinks about it sometimes, about the wedding that became a crime scene, about the moment her life split into before and after. She thinks about all the people at that wedding who had no idea what was happening upstairs, who went home thinking they'd attended a beautiful celebration. She wonders if any of them ever found out the truth, if they ever thought back to that night and realized they'd been dancing and laughing while something terrible was happening just 3 floors above them. And she thinks about Daniel, sitting in a prison cell, still insisting he's innocent, still believing, even now, that he's the victim in all of this. So here's the question that Emma asks herself late at night, the question that keeps her awake sometimes. Were the signs always there? Or was Daniel just that good at hiding who he really was? Her therapist says it doesn't matter, that it's not Emma's job to have seen into Daniel's soul, that the only person responsible for Daniel's actions is Daniel. But Emma can't quite accept that, because she loved him. She planned a future with him. She stood at an altar and promised to spend her life with him. And if she could be that wrong about someone, what else is she wrong about? How do you trust yourself again after something like that? How do you believe in love when the person who promised to love you turned out to be capable of something so cruel? Emma doesn't have the answers. Maybe no one does. But she's learning to live with the questions. She's learning that sometimes the people we love are strangers. That sometimes trust is a gamble we take, knowing we might lose. And that sometimes the only way forward is to accept that we'll never fully understand how we ended up here. Madison once told her, months after everything happened, that she didn't regret being at the wedding, that she'd do it again, knowing how it would end, because at least Emma found out who Daniel really was before they had children, before their lives were even more intertwined. Emma thinks about that sometimes, tries to find comfort in it, but mostly she just feels sad. Sad for the marriage that never was, sad for the friendship that was forever changed, and sad for every person who's ever trusted someone who didn't deserve it, who's ever looked back and wondered how they missed the warning signs. What do you think? Could Emma have known? Should she have seen the signs? Or was Daniel simply a master manipulator who fooled everyone who knew him? And if this happened to you, if you discovered that the person you married was capable of something like this, what would you do? Would you be able to forgive yourself for not seeing it sooner? These are the questions Emma lives with every day. And they're the questions we all should be asking ourselves. Because the truth is, predators don't look like monsters. They look like the person next to us at the coffee shop, the coworker who's always friendly, the friend who seems so normal. They look like someone we could love. And that's what makes them so dangerous. Daniel Crane is serving his sentence. Madison is rebuilding her life 3,000 miles away. And Emma is learning to trust again, one day at a time. But none of them will ever forget the night a wedding turned into a crime scene. The night when promises became lies. And the night when everything they thought they knew fell apart. This is the reality of assault. It doesn't just happen to strangers in dark alleys. It happens at weddings, at parties, in places where we're supposed to feel safe, with people we're supposed to trust. And until we acknowledge that, until we stop making excuses and start holding people accountable, it will keep happening. So what can we learn from Emma and Madison's story? That trust has to be earned, not just given. That red flags, no matter how small, deserve attention. That alcohol is never an excuse for violence. And that survivors deserve to be believed, even when believing them means accepting something we don't want to be true. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual assault, please reach out for help. Organizations like RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network offer free, confidential support 24/7. You are not alone. You are not to blame. And you deserve justice. Thank you for watching this story. We know it wasn't easy to hear. But these stories need to be told. Because silence protects predators. And speaking up protects survivors. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about trust and safety, and the people in your life, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts. Share your experiences if you feel comfortable. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. And look out for each other. Because that's how we change things. That's how we make sure stories like Emma and Madison's become less common, not more. Take care of yourselves. And remember, the people who deserve your trust are the ones who treat it like the precious thing it is.